I'm a fighter, but the uncertainty of not knowing if anybody knows you're missing, and to hear your other friends crowd in pain like that, it makes life seem so useless, really. So I prayed. Denis Hale, sole survivor of the SS Daniel J. Morrell. The freighter Daniel J. Morrell, built at the West Bay City, Michigan, West Bay City Shipbuilding Company as Hull 619, was launched on August 22, 1906, along with the Edward Y. Townsend. They were the longest vessels on the Great Lakes until the Kerr class of 1907. The ships registered 7,200 gross registered tons, a length of 603 feet, a beam of 58 feet, and a draft of 32 feet. The ships had one deck, with cargo hatches 24 feet across. A pair of coal-fired boilers and a triple expansion engine of 1,800 horsepower completed the power plant. The ship would receive some modifications over the course of its lifespan, and this included a new engine and boilers during the 1945 partial rebuild. The ship's career would span an impressive 60 years on the North American Great Lakes, carrying iron ore. Although old and leaking, Hale recalled that there has never been a time since I have been sailing that there's never been any holes in it. Hale and his crewmates still felt safe on the Morrell. There was no indication that they would face such a catastrophic structural failure on the final voyage of 1966. On November 29, 1966, in Lake Huron, making the last run of the season along with Edward Y. Townsend, the Morrell became caught in a gale with winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and swells of 20 to 25 feet that topped the height of the ship. During the early morning hours, Edward Y. Townsend radioed that they were going to take shelter in the St. Clair River. This left Daniel J. Morrell alone in the waters north of Pointe aux Bacs, Michigan, heading for the protection of Thunder Bay, Ontario. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Denis Hale's life would forever be changed. In an interview, he later stated that, "I was asleep when I heard a loud bang, and I thought it was the anchor hitting the bow. I rolled over trying to get back to sleep, and there was the second one, and this time the books came off my bookcase. I went to turn on my bunk light and it wouldn't come on. I knew right away something was wrong." Barely 8 minutes later, Hale, wearing a life jacket, pea coat, and boxers, along with many of his crewmates, jumped into the 34° Fahrenheit, 1° Celsius Lake Huron waters. At 2:15 in the morning, the ship broke in half, with the remaining crew on the bow loading into a raft. While they waited for the bow to sink, there were shouts that a ship had been spotted off the port side. Moments later, it was discovered that the looming object was not another ship, but Daniel J. Morrell's aft section barreling towards them under the power of the ship's engine. The bow then sank, throwing the raft into the lake. Daniel J. Morrell was not reported missing until 12:15 the following afternoon, November 30th. Failing to arrive at her destination of Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, the U.S. Coast Guard issued a "Be on the lookout" and dispatched several vessels and aircraft hoping to find the missing freighter. Over the next day, Denis Hale watched as one by one, the 3 crewmates with him passed away until he was the only one left on the raft. Hale tried to move around as much as possible and resorted to yelling, gagging himself, and keeping his fingers in his mouth to try and stay warm. At around 1600, a Coast Guard helicopter located the lone survivor. 26-year-old watchman Denis Hale, nearly frozen to death, and floating in a lifeboat with the bodies of 3 of his crewmates, who had managed to climb into the boat, but succumbed one by one to the elements. Hale had survived for nearly 40 hours in frigid temperatures, wearing only a pair of boxer shorts, a life jacket, and a pea coat. He would eventually undergo over a dozen surgeries. The Coast Guard rushed Hale to the hospital, Upon arrival, he was given his last rites. He had severe hypothermia, frostbite, and vascular damage to his lower limbs. Incredibly, he would be discharged in just 2 weeks. While in hospital, Hale repeatedly asked the nurse if any of his shipmates had been found. Until one day, the nurse said, "You should stop asking. It's been too long. If there's anybody else out there, they're dead." The remains of 26 out of the 28 lost crewmen were recovered, most in the days following the sinking, although bodies from the Daniel J. Morrell continued to be found well into May of the following year. The 2 men whose bodies were never recovered were declared legally dead in May 1967. 2 years before his death, Hale's wife asked him if he could speak to his crewmates, what would he say? He replied, "That I miss them, that I love them, and I'm glad of the time we had together." Denis Hale died of cancer on September 2nd, 2015, at the age of 75. The survey into the wreck found that the ship rested in 220 feet, 67 meters of water, with 2 sections 5 miles, 8 kilometers apart. It was found that the stern section did not sink for another 3 hours after the bow, as divers were able to read the clocks down in the engine room. To this day, the wreck remains a highly sought-after exploration for experienced divers, as it remains in pristine condition. The destructive force of the November seas and wind were an important factor into the loss, as it has been in many similar incidents on the Great Lakes. The Coast Guard investigation into the sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell concluded that she broke in half due to brittle steel used in her hull, which was a common problem in ships built before 1948. The same steel was used in the rivets on the bow and stern of the Titanic, and were a leading factor in the latter ship's demise. Edward White Townsend, after having escaped the same fate as her sister, had been discovered as having a large crack in her deck that grew worse from the same storm. She was declared a total loss and was docked for almost 2 years. Plans were made to tow the vessel to Europe to be scrapped. On her way during tow, she was caught in a storm on October 7, 1968, off Newfoundland. The ship snapped in 2, foundering in the general vicinity of the Titanic. In addition to the Edmund Fitzgerald, other contemporary Great Lakes freighters lost under similar circumstances were the Carl D. Bradley and the Henry Steinbrenner. Hale went on to write a popular book in 2010 about his survival and rescue, titled Shipwrecked: Reflections of the Sole Survivor. If you are interested in getting Hale's in-depth experience about his life at sea and the sinking of the Morrell, I strongly recommend you read it. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. If there's a topic you'd like me to cover, feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.